think we got everyone back. Perfect. All right. So let's work our way through this activity a little bit, and then we'll call it there for the day. Let's bring it up. Nope, that was not what I wanted to do. Wrong button. Try again. All right. So everyone should be seeing the activity. Is that right? Doing this right? I'll try this again. All right, let me try that again. Let's see if I can make it work this time. There we go. All right, now it should look like it's working. All right, so you've all been tasked with figuring out what to do as a result of this crisis in this fictional country that I've made up called Pardinia. What's the appropriate reaction for the United States government to take? And you know, in the news article, there's various kinds of sort of issues that people have brought up, various concerns, various options. And so your first task is going to be to sort of narrow this large range of issues and questions that get mentioned and others that maybe even didn't even get mentioned, and narrow it down to sort of one central question that's going to be the main thing you look at, and then various other kinds of subordinate questions that you will need to look at in the course of resolving that one central question. And so the one central question that I came up with, again, there's different ways of saying this. You don't have to say exactly what I say here, but it's something like, should the United States intervene in the conflict with Sardinia? And if they should, how should they intervene? And if not, of course, you wouldn't need to ask how. But if you answer yes, that's not enough. You need to say what should be done on the basis of it. But that question, one central question, is itself quite complex. It has a lot of different parts to it. So let's start breaking down some of its parts. So we could ask this question in sort of an ethical fashion. So ethically, should the United States intervene? We could also ask it sort of practically, right, or self-interested way. Should the United States intervene? Would it be in the best interest of the United States to intervene in the conflict? And in the course of those questions and other questions might get asked, what kind of intervention are we even talking about? Right? And again, we can ask that question both ethically and instrumentally. Right? What would be the most ethical kind of intervention? Also, what would be the most effective kind of intervention? Notice that we'll jump down to number two. I'm going to do number one and number two together just because they sort of go together. Right? We're starting to identify certain different kinds of questions. So this question, ethically, should the United States intervene? That's an ethical question. Right? It's asking about right and wrong morality in some broad sense. Whereas we're asking about sort of like practical kinds of questions. Would it be in the United States' best interest to intervene? Are we going to get economics benefits from it, non-economic benefits from it, military benefits from it? That's an instrumental question. And there we're still asking what should we do, but now it's a different kind of should. It's not a moral should. It's sort of like a pragmatic or self-interested kind of should. How can we get what we want out of the situation? Very different conversations we're going to have if we're focusing on this ethical question versus if we're focusing on this instrumental question. Similarly, the same thing here when we're talking about different kinds of intervention. Again, we can ask those questions ethically or instrumentally. All right, we can ask it as sort of, what's the morally right kind of intervention, or what's the most effective kind of intervention? What kind of intervention is going to get the job done, whatever the job is taken to be? But there's also other kinds of questions that are relevant in this context too. One I came up with is sort of a factual question. So we're sort of told that there are reports of human rights violations taking place. Are there actually human rights violations? Is that something that's really going on? Because if that's not really going on, that probably will indeed change how we answer some of the ethical questions, maybe, right? That's an example of a factual question. All we want to do there is simply describe how the world is. Human rights violations, are they taking place? Yes or no? Right? That's a purely descriptive project. Whereas the ethical and the instrumental question, in both cases, we have to go beyond merely describing what the situation is. We have to say, what should we do as a result of how the situation is? What should we do, again, ethically, or what should we do sort of like practically, pragmatically, self-interestedly? There's another kind of evaluative question that we could ask, but in this case, I don't think it's super relevant. I guess we could ask the question like, is the civil war in Pardinia beautiful or is it ugly? I guess you could ask that. That would be an example of an aesthetic judgment or question where we're sort of inquiring into sort of like beauty or how good something tastes. Again, it's a kind of good or bad, but not really an ethical kind of good or bad. But that doesn't seem really relevant in this case. And I guess you sometimes hear people say things like, oh, war is so ugly, we should not have wars because of how ugly they are. But that probably is just shorthand for kind of an ethical question. They mean it's just sort of like ethically ugly or something rather than bad to look at or ugly to look at. So an aesthetic question in this juncture, probably not super relevant. And I also didn't see any real interpretive questions, which is our fifth kind of question that would really be relevant here. An interpretive question is where, again, you're going beyond just the sheer facts to ask what those facts mean. And this question isn't really what does the crisis in Sardinia mean question, or what does it tell us about human nature or the future of the world. This is a what should we do question. And so it's going to need to be then more evaluatively oriented. All right, so like I said, we're going to spend pretty much all of Thursday talking about these different kinds of questions and different kinds of judgments, trying to get really clear, really honed in, really narrow on it. But does anyone have any questions right now based on just any of these or anything else your group came up with that you'd like to add that I didn't bring up in what I've said here? All good so far? All right, then let's move on to number 3. So basically these first 4 questions, they sort of are supposed to loosely correspond to the first 4 of the guidelines for inquiry. So we've done sort of the initial step. We framed the discussion, made it very clear what questions we're going to be looking at and what kinds of answers we would need to give to those questions. Now we need to turn to sort of you could call almost the fact-finding sort of portion, which is what's going on in the 3rd and 4th guidelines. So we now want to sort of take stock of what kinds of things are people saying in answer to these various questions that we're looking at. And at this point, we're not really endorsing any of these arguments or these positions. We're just taking stock of what things are people saying, what kinds of things are getting brought up. And, you could have used this sort of news report, this sort of fake news report to help you draw some of these. You could also just use things that you knew from outside class knowledge to help with them too. So I just picked 2 examples. There's lots of these you could go to. Again, you don't have to have given exactly the same things that I've said here. These are just examples of the kinds of answers that would work in this point. So maybe let's look at this sort of ethical question we talked about. Is it ethical to intervene? What would be a pro position, a position that suggests, yes, we do have some sort of ethical duty to intervene? Maybe you could hear someone make a kind of argument like more powerful countries have a duty to protect innocent people from crimes against humanity, especially when those crimes are carried out by their own governments. Right? So you can imagine someone this would be a sort of a heavily interventionist kind of argument. If someone were to make this argument, and if that argument was a good one, we would indeed seem, or the United States would indeed seem to have some sort of ethical duty to intervene in the conflict. Again, we're not necessarily endorsing it. We're just saying that this is an argument that we're going to need to look at. We're going to need to analyze this argument, see if it's a good or bad argument, because it's one of the things that people are saying about the situation that we're trying to inquire into. And then I came up with sort of a con position, something of why it would not be ethical to intervene. Perhaps someone might say that the principle of national sovereignty suggests that it is always wrong to intervene in what goes on in other countries without their permission, right? Crimes against humanity or anything else. And if that were true, if this is a good argument, if this is bringing up a good point, then there would be no ethical duty to intervene. Indeed, you might even go so far as to say there's an ethical duty to not intervene. And so if we're going to investigate this ethical question, these are 2 examples of arguments we would need to look at and analyze to figure out what we think the right answer is to this question of intervention. And I also gave another example, or came up with another example. So let's say we were going to ask about this other question: what kind of intervention would be effective? Again, what would be maybe a pro position for maybe military intervention, something that was in favor of using military intervention as a tool. Perhaps someone could argue that the only way to fully resolve a military crisis like a civil war is militarily, right? That's the only kind of solution that would work in this case. This would be an argument we would have to analyze. And then I gave 2 different con examples, things that would be opposed to military intervention. And the reason I gave these 2 is because I want you to notice how different the discussion would be in both of these cases. We would not have the same conversation depending on which of these you found more compelling. So someone could be opposed to military intervention because they thought too many American soldiers might die and that the cost, maybe the economic cost to the United States of the intervention would be too high. If we were going to analyze that argument, we'd be very much within sort of like a pragmatic kind of register, right? Like we could quite literally, we would just need to like predict what the expected death count would be, and we would need to predict what the economic cost would be. Right? Those would be the relevant kinds of data we would need to gather to, figure out if this is correct or not. On the other hand, here's another example of an argument people can make to be opposed to military intervention. That'd be that military intervention wouldn't work. Military intervention would just inflame tensions within the region. Notice what a different conversation would be. If we were looking at this argument and I was bringing up things like the cost to the United States of the intervention, it would be completely irrelevant. It's not the issue at hand, doesn't have anything to do with that. The issue at hand entirely hinges upon, is it going to work, rather than it would be too costly whether it worked or not. So that's one of the reasons why you need to and will want to be really precise in how you sort of identify these issues. Different issues are going to call for very different conversations, very different inquiries. All right. Again, let's pause here for a second. Any questions, any thoughts, any comments about anything here? Again, remember, you don't have to write exactly these down. These are just supposed to be sort of examples of the kinds of things you should have been saying. There's many more examples you could have written than just these. This is just examples of the kind of thing we should have been looking at. All right, let's go to the fourth one. Here we're asking more contextual questions. And in these contextual questions to be especially relevant to us in this case, because I made up Pardinia. It's not a real country, so we don't know anything about it. Right? We don't know any factors about it. We should want to know some things about it in the course of trying to determine which of these arguments are good, and in the course of trying to answer these various questions. So some contextual issues that occurred to me, at least. Maybe we should want to know what is the history of the conflict within Pardinia? How did this conflict emerge? What are the sides? What are the factors? Is it a long-standing dispute going back thousands of years, or is it a relatively new thing? Maybe we might want to know about what the historical relationship is between Pardinia and the United States. Are we historical allies? Are we historical enemies? Do the Pardinians like the United States? Do the Pardinians not particularly like the United States? That could easily affect questions like what kind of intervention is going to work. We also might want to know things about the surrounding issues, right? One of the concerns that was brought up in the news article is about protecting U.S. economic and military allies. So maybe we might want to know, how are other countries, maybe allies of the United States, but also maybe foes of the United States, dealing with this situation or dealing with this crisis? And then the last one I thought of maybe is an example of a kind of interpretive question. These are all factual questions. But here's kind of an interpretive question. How similar is the situation in Pardinia to other situations where the United States has intervened militarily, or maybe intervened in other regards? There have been various cases where the United States has tried to intervene in a conflict and it's gone really, really well. Or really, really well, maybe it's overstating. But it's gone at least moderately well. Maybe the situation in Kosovo in the late 90s, you might say that went reasonably well. And then there are times when it's gone very poorly. Maybe you would say Vietnam War as examples. It would be helpful perhaps to know which is Pardinia more like. Is it more like times when U.S. intervention has worked, or is it more like times when it hasn't worked? That's not purely a factual question. That's going beyond the facts and asking for an interpretation of what those facts mean. How do those facts compare to other facts? All right. Good here. Any questions on these first four? Awesome. So let's go to the last two questions, were sort of more big picture questions. I wanted you to think a little bit about how all these various kinds of topics that we brought up and concerns and arguments, how do they relate to one another? Because when you actually, at the end of the inquiry, sort of reach a conclusion, what should the US do? Right? That conclusion is going to sort of have to not just look at any of these things in isolation, but it's going to sort of have to combine them all together, see how various kinds of answers you discovered to these various different questions relate. So I want to just give some examples here. What if we could definitively prove that there is no ethical obligation of the United States to protect people outside of its own borders? Does that resolve the inquiry? Are we done with the discussion if we solve this? And I think the answer is no, we're not, actually really not. That maybe resolves the ethical question. Maybe its answer is ethically should the United States intervene. But there are other reasons why the US might want to intervene besides ethical ones. Or to put this slightly differently, do any of you believe that the United States government always and only acts ethically? Yeah, I'm guessing no. Right? There are other reasons why the United States government does things besides ethical ones. So we make, say, more self-interested questions, right? Maybe is it going to, for self-interested or practical reasons, is there still some advantage to intervening? Maybe economic, maybe military, maybe to support allies, right? Those questions aren't resolved when we resolve the ethical question. And so because of that, just solving the ethical question might solve part of our questions, but it's not going to resolve everything. Whereas I think let's contrast that with the case in number 6. So in number 6, say that we could definitively prove that US intervention is not going to work. It's not going to make the situation in Sardinia any better. Does that resolve the inquiry? I kind of think it does, actually. Ethically speaking, right, you wouldn't intervene if unless you thought intervention was gonna make things better, right? You don't have an ethical duty to make the situation worse, right? You would only have an ethical intervention to intervene if your intervention could improve things in some way. So that, even though it's not going to work, that's answering a instrumental question. It's answering a practical question. It's sort of the answer to that practical question has really strong implications for the broader ethical question of whether or not there's a duty to intervene in the conflict. And also, if we decided that there's no practical positive difference that's going to emerge from intervention, that also sort of resolves the instrumental question. And it's not going to be in the United States to intervene in a conflict when it's just going to make that conflict worse. Both the ethical and instrumental questions sort of get mutually answered by how we resolve this one question of is intervention going to make a practical difference? It has entailments upon both of those sort of sides of the central question. And so with that, then, that answering that question does indeed sort of end the debate or help resolve the entire inquiry if we could definitively prove it, if we could definitively come to that answer. So that's just intended to sort of show the way in which these various different kinds of questions do indeed relate to one another. It's not obvious, it's not the same for every question. There's different ways that that questions can be related, and you're going to have to sort of check in each case almost and see how do these different questions relate. All right. So does anyone have any questions from anything on that activity? Anything your group maybe talked about that I didn't get to that you'd like to go over, or anything else? All right, awesome. So this was a good place for us to end it for the day, I think. Make sure you get this turned in by the end of the day, like normal. We're going to do on Thursday, we're just going to focus only on identifying these different kinds of questions and different kinds of judgments. That'll be, like I said, a lot of the exam will be dedicated to that question. So we'll really hit it hard on Thursday. I've got a group activity, like 14 examples. So you get really, really solid on it. That's what we'll do then. Otherwise, I hope you all have a good rest of your week until that point, and I'll see you on Thursday. Thank you very much. Have a good one.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Have a good one.